Chapter 1. The Man from Alabama. In 1963, a black minister from a small town in Alabama, in the south of the United States, led a march of more than 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. There, he made a speech that became famous. "I have a dream," he said. He dreamed of all the people of America, black and white, living together in peace and freedom. He said that all men and women should be equal. Many of the marchers cried as they listened to him. The minister's speech was shown on television all over the world, and he became a hero to millions of people who saw and heard the speech. But there were also people who hated this man and his ideas. They did not want black people to be free. They did not want them to have equal rights. In 1968, less than 5 years after his famous speech, a white man shot him dead. The minister was only 39 years old. When people heard of his death, there was much sadness, and people cried in the streets. But many people were very angry too, and there were riots in the big cities. In Chicago and Washington, black people burned buildings and fought the police. Hundreds of black people were killed in these riots. 15 years after his death, the government of the United States made his birthday a holiday. Today, he is remembered as one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century. Who was this man? Why did so many people love him? Why did others hate him? The man from Alabama, the man who had a dream, was Martin Luther King, and the story of his life is the story of a people's fight for freedom. Chapter 2. Growing up in the South. Martin Luther King was born on the 15th of January, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His father, who was also called Martin Luther King, was the minister in an Atlanta church. The King family were not poor. They lived in a good neighborhood of Atlanta, and they had enough money to live comfortably. When Martin thought about his early years in Atlanta, he remembered a loving family and friendly neighbors. But the King family were black. Less than 100 years before Martin Luther King was born, his people were slaves. Even in 1929, black people in the South of the United States did not have the same rights as white people. Blacks and whites lived in different worlds. When blacks traveled on buses, they had to sit at the back of the bus. They could not sit beside whites. Most restaurants did not sell food to black people. There were different schools for black children and white children. It was like this all over the South. Blacks and whites lived in the same places, but they were kept away from each other. This was called segregation. "Segregation is wrong, but things will get better in time," said Martin's father. "White people will start to think differently one day. We should be patient and wait, because you can't hurry change. It will come, but not soon. We have to wait for it." Young Martin did not agree with his father. If you want to change things, you have to act, he thought. He knew himself what segregation meant. When he was very small, he played with a little white boy across the street from his house. His friend's name was Warren. When Martin started school, he looked for Warren, but he was not there. After school, he went to Warren's house and asked to play with him. The boy's mother said that Martin could not play with Warren anymore because Martin was black. and his friend was white. When Martin came home that day, he was crying. He told his mother what had happened. "It doesn't matter what other people think," she told him. "You're as good as anyone else. Don't you ever forget that." Martin remembered his mother's words. He knew that she was right. He was as good as any white boy. But as he grew older, he saw how white people treated black people in Atlanta. Once, when he was in the center of town, he walked into a white woman. It was an accident, but the white woman hit him on the face. When someone asked her why she had done this, the woman replied, "That little black bastard stepped on my foot." Martin's face hurt, but the name that she called him, little black bastard, hurt him even more. When he started high school at the age of 11, Martin began to make speeches. Of course, he often spoke in church, but at school he talked about the need for change in the South. When Martin was 14 years old, he won a prize for one of his speeches. He traveled to Washington with his teacher to get his prize, and they returned to Atlanta by bus. When a white man got on the bus, there were no empty seats, so the driver told Martin to get up and give the white man his seat. Martin refused. Why should he give his seat to this man? The bus driver became angry and called him bad names. Finally, Martin gave the white man his seat because he did not want to make trouble for his teacher. But he was angry. It was not fair that he had to stand while a white man sat in his seat. He did not want to hate white people, but sometimes it was hard not to hate them. Chapter 3. Slavery and the South. In 1929, when Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta, Georgia, most black people in America lived in the South. In fact, 9 out of every 10 African Americans lived in the South. In every way, their lives were worse than the lives of Southern whites. They were poorer, they lived in worse houses, their lives were shorter. Most blacks in the South could not vote. Some black people who were alive in 1929 had been slaves. They had belonged to their white owners, and they were treated like things, not people. White people could buy and sell slaves just like houses or land. In the past, many countries have used slaves. Hundreds of years ago, there were slaves in Rome and Athens. They worked on farms and in the houses of rich people. But they were not slaves forever. After some years, they became free men and women again. But in North and South America, slavery was different. In the 16th century, people from European countries like Britain, Spain, and Portugal began to move into North and South America. They cut down forests and cleared the land for farms. They needed men and women to work on their farms. Where could they find them? The answer was Africa. Men and women were taken from their homes in Africa and brought to North and South America to work on farms and on roads. From about 1500 to 1850, European ships took at least 10 million men and women from Africa to become slaves in the Americas. The ships were very full, and the men and women did not have enough food, water, or air. Hundreds of thousands of Africans never reached America. They died on these slave ships. When African slaves arrived in America, they were sold to white farmers. Often, people from the same family were sold to different owners and never saw each other again. Husbands lost their wives, and children were taken away from their mothers. In the South of the United States, the farms were very big. The farmers usually grew sugar or cotton, and they needed slaves to do the hard work in the fields. The white farmers gave the slaves food, clothes, and houses, but the slaves had to stay on the farm. They belonged to the farmer. When slaves ran away, they were usually caught and brought back to their owners. Then they were beaten, and sometimes even killed. Many slaves fought against the slave owners. In 1791, a black slave called Toussaint Louverture led an army of slaves against French soldiers on the island of Haiti. Toussaint died in a French prison, but in 1804, Haiti became the first free black country. In Virginia, in 1831, a slave called Nat Turner led slaves against their white owners. They did not succeed, and Turner himself was killed. But the slave owners were afraid that one day the slaves would win the fight. Some black leaders wanted to return to Africa. In 1822, a new country was born in West Africa. This was Liberia, a country for people who were once slaves but were now free. 100 years later, African-American leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, argued for a return to Africa. After 1808, it was against the law to bring slaves from Africa to the United States. But the number of slaves in the South continued to grow. By 1860, there were more than 4 million slaves in the South. They were no longer Africans, but African Americans, and they wanted to be free. When Americans wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, they said that men and women should be free and equal. But the men who wrote the Declaration owned slaves. How is this possible? This was a difficult question. By the 19th century, many black people had become Christians. They went to church on Sunday, just like their white owners. Blacks and whites both read the Bible, and the message of the Bible was the same. All men and women, black or white, are equal in God's eyes. More and more people in Europe and America thought that slavery was wrong. Britain ended the buying and selling of slaves in 1807. A year later, America did the same. Many northern states ended slavery, and they wanted it to stop all over the United States. But southern slave owners wanted to keep their slaves. They refused to free them, and they were ready to fight for their right to own slaves. The southern states were ready to go to war for these rights. Chapter 4. War in America and After. Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States in 1860. He wanted to end slavery in America, but the South wanted to keep their slaves. So 7 southern states decided to leave the United States of America. The North and South went to war in 1861. More than 180,000 black soldiers fought for the North. In 5 years of terrible fighting, more than 500,000 soldiers on both sides were killed. The North won the war, and slavery in the South ended in 1865. Now there were no more black slaves in America. But black people in the South did not have the same rights as white people. Blacks could not go to white schools, and there were very few schools for blacks. Blacks could not go to the same shops or restaurants as whites. When blacks did try to get their rights, whites often answered them with violence. Most whites in the South were angry that they had lost the war. They did not agree with the end of slavery or with equal rights for blacks. In 1867, a group of soldiers in the southern state of Georgia started a secret organization to fight against black rights. This organization was called the Ku Klux Klan. They wanted to frighten blacks and stop them from voting in elections. Klansmen dressed in white clothes and covered their faces so nobody could see who they were. Sometimes they took black people out of their homes and beat them or killed them. They also burned the schools, homes, and churches of black people. In the 1890s, more than 1,000 blacks were killed by whites in the South. Most blacks were too frightened to tell the police, because many policemen in the South actually belonged to the Klan. Early in the 20th century, more than 4 million whites belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. Now that blacks were not slaves, they were free to move out of the South. Thousands of blacks left the South and moved to northern cities like Chicago and Detroit. There was more freedom for blacks in the North, and there was work for them in the factories. By the beginning of the 20th century, a quarter of blacks lived outside the South, mostly in big northern cities. In the 20th century, blacks began to play a more important part in the life of America. New schools and universities for blacks opened. Jazz, the music of black people, became popular all over the world. Harlem, a black neighborhood of New York City, became the center for black musicians like Duke Ellington and black writers like Langston Hughes. Paul Robeson was a famous black singer and actor. He sang about the troubles of black people. But many whites were angry when he appeared in Shakespeare's play Othello with a white actress as his wife. There were many black sportsmen. The great black runner, Jesse Owens, won gold medals for America at the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. As Hitler and other Nazi leaders watched, Owens beat the best white runners. The boxer, Joe Louis, was born into a poor black family in Alabama in 1914 and was taken to Detroit when he was 10 years old. In 1937, he became the world boxing champion. His greatest fight was against the German boxer Max Schmeling. Louis had lost to Schmeling in their first fight. When Schmeling returned to Germany, he was called a hero by the Nazis. Hitler himself said that because Schmeling had won, whites were stronger than blacks. When Louis beat Schmeling in 1938, blacks all over America were wildly happy. Joe Louis fought 20 times as world champion and was never beaten. But once again, the greatest changes in the lives of black people came from a war. In 1941, America entered the Second World War. Black soldiers fought bravely for their country, but the American army was segregated. Black soldiers did not fight beside white soldiers, and they were not treated as well as white soldiers. When black soldiers protested about this, there were often fights between black soldiers and white soldiers. When these black soldiers returned to America, they wanted equal rights for themselves. In some of the countries they had visited, black people had the same rights as white people and were treated fairly. After the war, even more blacks moved to the North and became richer. Some things got better. Black workers in 1950 were paid twice as much as black workers in 1940, and more blacks began to go to university. But black Americans got much less money than white Americans, even when they were doing the same jobs. Many fewer blacks than whites went to university, and even in the North, there was still the problem of racism. The Second World War had been a war against racist ideas. Many whites in America realized that their own country was racist. Blacks began to vote, and white politicians began to listen to them. In 1948, President Truman ended segregation in the Army. In 1954, a new law said that blacks and whites must go to the same schools and learn together. Things were getting better for black people, but they wanted more. They were ready for someone to lead them towards greater freedom. They were ready for Martin Luther King. Chapter 5. Learning. Martin Luther King was an excellent student. When he was only 15, he went to Morehouse College in Atlanta. He was a clever young man, and he finished his studies there in 1948. Martin's father wanted him to be a minister, but at first Martin said no. He did not want to follow his father so soon. He was learning exciting new ideas from his teachers at Morehouse, and there was so much more that he wanted to know. But slowly, Martin began to think differently. He decided to become a minister, like his father, but to be a teacher too. He went to Crozer, a college for ministers in Pennsylvania in the North. There were many white students at the college, but Martin was happy to find that they were friendly towards him. In fact, they welcomed him.